speeches, presentations, talks, we say them to influence people, to make them understand, to pass knowledge. And it's a surreal environment we find ourselves where we're delivering speeches in a virtual without an audience. But the real beneficiary of any talk or any speech is the person who's speaking. And therefore today I'm going to talk about things that I hope that will influence me and benefit me and improve me. And I hope that what I share with you today will also inspire you and will also touch you. But I hope that we speak now and going forward in a way to improve ourselves. So what I'm going to talk about is fair access and the concept of fair access around inequality and the way we now work to try and address some of the inequalities that we will see more apparent because of this pandemic. But I'm not necessarily going to talk about all of the strategies that many people better placed than me can talk about. But what I'm going to share with you today is about my own personal experience from the people that I've seen, upon whose shoulders today I stand, and the values that we inherited on the way that they embarked upon addressing the issues of fair access and inequality. The pandemic has created great disadvantage, great upheaval, great stress, great anxiety, great loss. But I believe one of the benefits to come out of this pandemic is that people are now reconnecting to their purpose. And I do believe that every person, anywhere in the world, is connected to a purpose for good. We all have a heroic mission inside us. And sometimes that heroic mission gets lost because of the preoccupations and distractions of the world. But I think the pandemic has put a spotlight and it stirred that heroic mission into us as it's happened. And there's many people today who are now choosing to change their careers, to do something worthwhile, to work in our NHS, to work in education, to work in social justice. And many of us will embark on that journey. Many of us will take leadership in that area, whether in government or in charity or institutions. And we will be chairing and driving now for good to try and address some of that disadvantage and the inequalities that we acutely see around us and we'll see more of, and there's no doubt about it. There are so many people who have been disadvantaged more than before because of this pandemic. But what I'm going to share with you is that many times we inherit these institutions and we will embark on a campaign, on a movement to address the fair access agenda, and we inherit those institutions or those charities or those organizations. But sometimes we don't look into the values of our predecessors who established those institutions. We inherit the mechanism, the activities, and we very quickly move towards trying to then progress things by looking outward and looking to other people to help solve that problem. But very little do we sometimes look into the values that drove those pioneers who were inspired and who were the people, as I said, on whose shoulders today we stand. And because of them, we're able to do the things that we aspire and we are able to do. And I'm going to share with you an experience and a journey that I've had the privilege of having, of being touched by such pioneers whose values, whose principles have very much led us to be able to achieve prosperity and parity and give fair access to communities that didn't previously have them. And therefore, I think before we rush in or embark upon this noble endeavor, start to listen to that heroic mission, I think we should start with ourselves. And because as we think, so shall we be. And there are three principles that I want to share with you that, again, through a group of incredible men, ordinary men, who had a heroic mission and who are incredible because they saw the genius in humanity. And this is not, I'm not going to talk about a sort of Dickensian era or something that happened a few centuries ago. I'm talking about 80s Britain and how a group of men, ordinary men, embarked on a heroic mission with principles, and three principles in particular that I want to sort of share with you today, that were the overarching dynamic that has led to us being able to bring fair access to education, particularly, and I'll touch on what that has meant to more than just their community. So what qualifies me to talk about fair access? Well, growing up in the 70s, first generation migrant community, there was a lot of things that we didn't have fair access to, not least fair access to a bathroom. 15 in a house, there wasn't really fair access. As being the youngest, you pretty much got the short end of the stick. And there were many things as growing up as a migrant community. Our parents came from the Indian subcontinent to an industrial town in Blackburn, and they came to achieve prosperity. And I'll come on to the definition of prosperity, because we talk about prosperity, but I do believe prosperity, there's a perception to prosperity, and I'll touch on that as well. That they came and settled in the 60s, leaving their families behind, their worldly belongings behind, to set out a journey for the future generation, us, to be more prosperous. And there were many, many sacrifices that were made to do that. But what I say is that that's probably when we realized that there wasn't fair access, and we didn't have fair access to, proper education. I don't believe that, when we talk about unconscious bias, we didn't have unconscious bias, we had very deliberate bias. So going back to these three values and why I believe that we start with ourselves is, as we were growing up in the early 80s, we heard about this new school that was setting up in our community. And all of a sudden, just right opposite my house, there was this terraced house that had been turned into a school. And one morning, all these girls were starting to go into this school, and we were thinking, what's going on here? We've got these schools that we go to, and then there's this school that's been set up in our own community on the terrace, 2 up, 2 down terrace. So we thought, how strange. Little did we know that there will come a time that we'd be running that school, but that was, still further on. So anyway, going back to the principle why this school was created. So some of the elders, when they came in the 60s, and we are from a very patriarchal community, and therefore the meritocracy of fair access to education for girls wasn't and isn't still in many parts of the world available. And these elders, these pioneers, these incredible human beings, they saw this for their community to say, we need to empower our women, our young women, to be able to have reverence to education, because their mantra was, in the mother's lap is the first school. And when we talk about fair access, we have to start at that level, because many, many moms and families don't have that, and therefore the children want to access that straight away. And that is a challenge in itself, but we have to understand why that is. It's not no fault of their own. So they were seeing that there's this issue, cultural and social, and these girls were going into comprehensive schools, and one particular school, which was about 1.5 miles away, and there was a bit of a disconnect from the parents towards the reverence to educating their daughters. So there's a group of these men went to actually speak to the head teacher to say, look, we're a bit worried about the fact that our parents aren't focused on the girls as much as they should be, and could you make allowances on certain levels for them to be able to continue into that education. Now this head teacher, and I'm coming to the first principle about if you're embarking on this endeavor to help others to achieve fair access, one of the principal values we must have is open-mindedness. That we must be able to appreciate another person's perspective. And there, in that conversation as it went, these were, slightly elderly men. They looked different. Their language was somewhat broken because English wasn't their first language. And this head teacher wasn't open-minded. And he took offense. So he, very in a matter-of-fact way, sent them on their way and just set them with a message to say, well, if you're not happy with the education I'm offering, why don't you do it for yourself? Now that was, any one of us could have been very offended by that, could have been very upset by that. And I come to this first value, that today we live in a society where we're constantly offended. We constantly get upset because of what we see, what we hear, somebody's dress, somebody's language, the way somebody eats, or what they do. And if we are going to really achieve the endeavor, this noble endeavor of trying to bring equality and trying to bring fair access, we must be open-minded. And what those elders showed at that moment in time was not to become offended, not to rebuke or not to challenge, not to set out into an adversarial conversation, but took it upon themselves to come back to that principle of, well, we need to change ourselves before we can expect the outside world to appreciate something. We need to change ourselves. So what they did was they bought a house. Before they've even bought their own house, they bought a house so that those young girls who were not getting that full education in that comprehensive school could actually do that. And they endeavored onto that mission, that heroic mission to say, we must give parity of education to our young women as much as we are pushing our boys to do so. And so the journey started. And but they didn't have any money, they didn't have any resources, and they didn't even know what education in the UK mainstream looked like. So what they did was they convinced retired head teachers or retired teachers to come and teach for free. And now that in itself is a miracle, because these are people of a different community, and they are reaching out to these retired teachers, and they paid them with biscuits. So they found out what their favorite biscuits were, and they would put those biscuits and tea in front of them, and they would then teach in the classroom with those young women. And they also did some babysitting, because many of those were grandparents and they used to have childcare responsibilities for their own children, so they used to bring their grandchildren. So these fellows would then babysit them. So they don't even cradle their own children, and they were cradling somebody else's grandchildren. But because they were committed to this heroic mission, they were able to do that. And guess what? Those retired teachers also followed them because their intention was pure. And this is the second part of these principles, that we must ensure that our intention is always clear. And intention is a word that I think is misused many times. We say intention in the way that, well, I am going to do something. Everybody sets out, I'm going to do something. And even in this fair access agenda, we will start off and say, I am going to change this. I am going to campaign. I am going to lead this. And even as an entrepreneur, when we start our journey in entrepreneurship, it's always about I. But I don't believe intention is about what you do. It's how you connect to a purpose. We all have that purpose, but it's the connection between us and that purpose which is the intention. And what these elderly pioneers, incredible human beings did was they connected to a noble purpose. And because their connection was pure, these retired teachers felt compelled to be part of that purpose. And that's the second fundamental that we must bring through before we embark upon that journey. Anyway, the school grew, 300-400 girls in it, became the best school in the town. And there came a time that these men approached us. We were up and coming, just left university, muddled through the education system, and they must have seen something in us, a group of us, and they said, well, here we are entrusting you with this school. And what did we know about school? We were just trying to make our own way in life, and now all of a sudden we've got this responsibility, but you didn't say no to these guys. Because again, their intention was pure. You couldn't say no to these people. So we then took it on and said, right, let's do what we can do. But because that intention was pure, we got then a help from the local authority to say, look, you've been operating this school for now nearly 15 years from a terraced house. The girls have never had a canteen, a playground, a hot meal. We are now giving you a brand new school, and it's 1.5 miles away. And we're thinking, wow, that's so brilliant, a brand new school for our girls. They're the best school in the town. Now they're going to get a place that they deserve. But we had to convince the elders, because the elders would still say, well, wait a minute, who told you to do that? So we went to do a petition to them and convince them to say, we've got to move from outside the community 1.5 miles away to this brand new school. They're closing the existing school, and we're going to move in there with our Tahidal girls school. So we put this impassioned pitch to them, and we received a wry smile from a few of them. Some had passed on already. And then they told us this story. The story about them going to petition this head teacher to convince him to try and be more appreciative of the social and cultural dynamics of our community. And then they said, well, the school we went to petition is the school that you have now been given to move into. And that in itself, and whenever I speak about it, hairs stand up on the back of my neck, because it's so inspiring that this was their mission, the heroic mission, that they had nothing, no real physical attributes or infrastructure, but because their intention was pure, today people are coming to help us. And on the back of that one school, today that school is ranked the best performing school in the country, and has been for the last 4 or 5 years. And on the back of that school, we've been able to now open 30 schools. And we have 20,000+ young people that we're giving fair access to education to in Morecambe, in Birmingham, in London, in Bradford. Places and communities that aren't necessarily seen as our community, but on the back of those pioneers, that one school, that heroic mission, today we are able to give fair access to so many others. And the alumni of that school, today if you walk into the hospitals of Blackburn, Preston and the regions, you will find those young women who are doctors and surgeons giving fair access to healthcare. You will see those young women as head teachers and teachers giving fair access to education. You will see those young women in the hallowed turf of Oxford and Cambridge receiving their peers to give them fair access to the seats of learning that we didn't have access to. And the final attribute that they had was self-awareness, of humility. And we embark on these endeavors to be driving fair access. Sometimes we get caught up in the whole mechanism, the whole machinery of it, and we fail to bring people into that endeavor who are better than us because our ego gets in the way. Because it's me, it's what I am doing. We must seek out people who can do more for that noble endeavor. And what they had in their values was humility. And that is a fundamental principle that we must always be checking ourselves, because the whole hullabaloo of doing good things, the intention becomes rusty. The link between you and the purpose becomes rusty. And when it becomes rusty, your motivations change. Even in entrepreneurship, you start off being a superhero, and then you turn into an anti-hero because you start being paranoid and skeptical about the reality of the situation, and your motives change. Your endeavor is the same, but your motives for why you do it, because there's money now, there's status. Those men have no statues. They don't have pictures on the wall. People don't even know their names. They have gone to their graves, but they have gone with abundance. And I will end on this point, that prosperity isn't just about money. It isn't just about accumulation of wealth. It's about joy, happiness, wisdom, fulfillment, peace of mind. What can't be traded, what can't be sold, what can't be bought. This is what our communities came here for abundance, for happiness, for joy and family and friends. And these men had that in abundance, because for them prosperity wasn't about accumulation of wealth. It's about a heroic mission to believe in the genius of humanity and do something about it in a noble and sincere way. And that today, if we are going to set out to address the inequalities in the world today, that we must start with ourselves and start to think about ourselves before we start to think about others. Because I tell you this, that we can do with biscuits and babysitting what billions can't do in the same way. Thank you very much.